Auditor of State's training for the ADAMH boards. Today's training, we will be able to record it. You should have all received from Michaela this morning handouts for the presentation. If you have not received them, we'll make sure we'll get them to you after the presentation is over. We're going to ask everybody to keep their phones mute throughout the presentation. And when we get to the point of questions and answers, we might prompt you to unmute your phone, but that will be directed by our presenters today. We're going to ask that all of the questions go into the chat box. Our presenters today have committed to, if they cannot address the questions, if they have a log of the questions, they will get back to us any questions that they weren't able to answer. So I'm going to ask you to make sure you get all of your questions in the chat box. Just as a reminder, they will not be able to answer, and I think they're going to go over this in their presentation, any program-specific questions, but other questions, like I said, if they're not able to answer, they said as long as they have a log of them, they'll follow back up with us. I think that was all my talking points. So let me introduce my speakers, because I know you guys didn't get on today to hear me talk. So today we have with us Rhonda Klein. Rhonda has been with the Auditor of State's office for over 33 years. In that time, she has worked 19 years in the field auditing local governments as a staff auditor, audit manager, and finally as a senior audit manager prior to moving into the Center for Audit Excellence as a quality assurance and technical specialist. She was later promoted to Chief of Professional Standards. The center is primarily responsible for assuring the Auditor of States remain current with ever-changing accounting and auditing standards. The center is responsible for the development of all Auditor of State's auditing tools and quality assurances based upon the National Accounting and Auditing Standards and Ohio law. In addition, the center ensures that all Auditor of State's employees are up to date on these standards. We also have with us today Richard Cunningham. Rich is a quality assurance technical specialist with the Center for Audit Excellence of the Auditor of State's office, and is responsible for providing consulting services for the Central and West regions. Rich also assists with training presentations and updating various forms and guidance used by the Auditor of State's office. Rich has been with the center since 2015, but has been with the Auditor of State's office for over 25 years and served as a senior audit manager for the East region for 16 years before joining the center. Rich also worked for a CPA firm in Massillon for over 8 years before joining the Auditor of State's office. Some of you guys might also remember Rich because he was one of our presenters when we rolled out the Behavioral Health Handbook. So that's why you guys might also recognize Rich. But with that said, I am going to turn today's presentation over to our presenters. And as I mentioned earlier, they will be entertaining any questions that you put in the chat box at the very end of the presentation.
Good morning. I hope everybody had a nice weekend. The weather was beautiful. I live in Ironton, Ohio, and if you don't know where that is, it's down in southern Ohio across from Ashland, Kentucky. We spend as much time as possible outside. I was telling Fonda that my husband and I put up Christmas lights all weekend, trying to get prepared for the holidays. So it just makes us smile. The sunshine was wonderful. Fonda reached out to our office to see if we could provide a training to discuss different things, such as responsibilities as a result of your federal funding, uniform guidance requirements, and an auditor's perspective of the trends that we see when auditing these mental health boards. And so we do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and we hope that the information is very useful. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to talk about the single audit requirements, the different responsibilities that exist with testing, documentation, some resources. As Fonda says, we can't answer programmatic decisions such as, what's allowable cost for your specific questions for your programs. But as auditors, we have to maintain that independence. However, we do hope that the training provides you with useful tools on understanding what your requirements are, maybe knowing where to find the answers that you need, and just especially in regards to the single audit. I have to start the training with a disclaimer. As you know, the funding is flowing out, this COVID funding is flowing out as quickly as more quickly than the guidance is. There's been a lot of money brought out, and there's been weeks, maybe even a couple months before requirements have been sent. And so this information is current as of today, but it could easily change tomorrow. Our office maintains a COVID-19 website, and Rich is going to show you that website when he does his presentation. And on that website, we have frequently asked questions. We have a spreadsheet that we've tried to identify all the different funding that we think might be tied to the COVID acts that came out providing the funding. And so we've identified, I think there's 108 now. And so there's a lot of pieces and parts coming through. So keep in mind that, you know, again, this is current as of today, but we're hopeful that it stays that way. But again, the guidance can change. All right, so let's talk about single audit. Most of your boards are single audit. We have found, and Rich will talk about some of the details, that there's the times that you haven't been a single audit, and you may wonder, you know, what are you talking about when you say single audit? Why do I have to have a single audit? Why is that important? I mean, you're doing a great job, and the service that you provide that results in all of the you know, the services to your clients is amazing. And so, you know, why do you have to fool with all of this paperwork in detail? Well, it's important because of the federal money that you receive. And so there has to be that oversight. And so the uniform guidance is put in place. It's an authoritative set of rules and requirements for those federal awards. And so it's getting to know what the requirements are and how to comply with those in order to provide these services. All right, so the single audit is set forth in the 2 CFR. Some of you may remember a reference to A133, and that was pre-uniform guidance. When it was revised, that's the new title, is uniform guidance. And it's for any entity that expends $750,000 or more in federal funding. And there's a lot of different guidelines. There's a lot of different pieces and parts to what is a federal expenditure. It includes payments to your subrecipients, and we're going to talk about what happens when you are a subrecipient and when you have a subrecipient of your funding as well. And so in calculating the expenditures, it includes your grants, your direct appropriations, your cooperative agreements, your loans, loan guarantees, which typically your agencies do not have, any non-cash contributions that you may receive. And in the scope of a single audit, it's just we start with that federal schedule, that schedule of expenditures of federal awards, and we often refer to that as a CFA. And the goal is to making sure that that CFA is accurate in relation to the financial statements. In other words, is everything reported in the right place? Is all the activity reported and properly in regards to your framework that you report your financial statements on? And so making sure that that federal schedule is reported properly. We have to understand their internal controls specific to your programs. And we have to make sure that we look at whether you've complied with those federal statutes. So it's very important for you to know what those statutes are, and also your grant terms and conditions, because that can go from your pass-through, OMOS, down to have additional requirements than what the federal government puts in the compliance supplement. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. And so preparing that complete and accurate CFA that is your starting point. So then we look at, you might ask, how do I know what programs you're going to look at? Well, uniform guidance is very specific, and the expenditure thresholds for that major program, I've included the reference here. Typically, it's $750,000 in expenditures is what we call a Type A program. There's Type A and Type B. And so there's a risk-based approach that the federal government requires that we follow. And we look at, has that program been audited before? If it's over $750,000, it would be a Type A program. And so Then we do that risk-based to see if there were any comments in the prior year, if it was audited, you know, if there are any compliance issues, and then determine whether that would be considered a high risk A or a not high risk A. And so then we have a type B programs or any other programs that you would have that would be under 750,000. And we risk analyze those as well. And so there's a replacement process and so forth that we have to follow if we have a high risk B and then there's low risk A's. But in the end, we determine what those major programs are, and then we know exactly what we need to test based on the compliance supplement. Next slide. Sorry, Michaela, I haven't been really good about telling you that. All right, so here are the uniform guidance subparts. There are 6, and there's a lot of information, a lot of subsections that are within each of these subparts. The audit requirements specifically that we follow, and there are requirements in subpart F for the auditee as well. And we're going to talk about that with your corrective action plans and your CFO, of course, and that we've already spoke of, and a few other pieces and parts that you have to do. But that subpart F is where our requirements are. So if you want to know what we have to do as auditors, so you know what to prepare for. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the uniform guidance, must is a requirement and should is a best practice. And so if you see the must, you need to make sure that you do follow that. The shoulds are also a good idea. Of course, they're best practice, but that's something you want to take a hard look at. So each of these subparts includes different requirements depending on what you're looking at, whether it be the cost principle, your general provisions. If you really just want to understand, we live in a world of acronyms. And so thankfully, they've included a subpart A that has those acronyms and definitions included. Next slide, please. So the uniform guidance has to go under a review every 5 years, and that's required by the Office of Budget and Management. It's in 2 CFR 200.109 that they have to do this, and so they look at this and make changes accordingly. And so the proposed changes that they have are bringing the uniform guidance in line with other authoritative requirements, and they clarify requirements regarding areas that maybe were misinterpreted. And so these are upcoming changes. They're going to be generally, and I say generally because 2 are effective now, but they are going to become effective November 13th. But it's for new awards issued after that effective date. So there's some time to get to know the changes. We're just going through them now to find out how that's going to affect what we do. And so we have, to get up to speed really quick, but it's for any new awards that came out after November 13th. So one thing to keep in mind, for UG changes, each federal agency has to take action to adopt the updated regulations in their current form, or they can make some changes to it as they deem necessary. So uniform guidance, we have to look at every agency to determine if they've got additional changes or additional requirements that have been put into place. And so it's important that you know what your particular agency requires. Most of your money comes through OMAS. And so understanding what the oversight agency has put in place is extremely important. A couple of the other changes that the updates they have are for procurement requirements. They've enhanced the clarity for certain methods of procurement, increased some thresholds that are put in place. They've also expanded the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate to all entities. There are some general definition and terminology changes, and then some additional pass-through entity requirements. One of the most significant changes that you'll see is that the CFDA number, which is the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance number, which is, we'll talk about CFDA numbers here for your programs, that is being changed to the Assistance Listing Program title. Hard to get out there. And so you'll see that the new programs will have this listing, but it means the same as the current CFDA. And from what we understand, that you'll have both moving forward until the ones with the CFDA programs expire. All right, next slide, please. So what are your auditors looking at? So we'll start with this, with your federal schedule, your CFA. We'll test that to determine the major programs we talked about. And then we're going to go forward. We have to test controls. We're required to at least attempt to test controls. And then we're going to test the compliance supplement procedures and pass-through entity requirements. Now, the pass-through entity will have a ton of requirements that will go, to help you with every area that you work through. But we as auditors only look at those pass-through requirements that are key to the federal compliance that's in the compliance supplement. And so that compliance supplement is issued on an annual basis. And it unfortunately is being issued in 2 parts this year, which we'll talk about. And of course, in addition, requirements may be outlined by that pass-through agency. So you want to make sure you know what those requirements are and what your pass-through requires. And OMB should provide that information to you for your programs. And again, I recognize for these COVID programs, a lot of the guidance is coming out much later than the funding. And so it's sometimes hard to know what you need to do and what the pass-through is requiring. They have a lot of information on their website. I think the most useful tool is that Table B, and Fonda provided a copy of that for us to see, an updated copy. And it has your program lead and your fiscal lead, so you can reach out to that particular person for any questions that you might have. So we also have to do, as part of this single audit, a risk assessment on the entity. So each of you in your audits we have to do that are a single audit. We have to do a risk assessment of your entity. And what that involves is looking at your reporting framework. So if you're not reporting on a GAAP basis, maybe you're reporting on the AOS regulatory, or even on what we call OACBHA cash basis, which is a GAAP lookalike statement, you would not qualify as a low risk entity. You have to report on GAAP. We also look at your past single audit compliance opinions and things that we've reported, such as material weaknesses or significant deficiencies or material non-compliance. So if you're a low risk auditee, we're going to have to test only 20% of your programs, of the expenditures. So that most of your expenditures are in your block grant. So typically it covers most of what would need to be tested, unless one of your other programs was a higher risk program. If you're not a low risk auditee, and that's the language they use, low risk and not low risk, is 40% needs to be tested. And again, you're probably going to get that coverage with your block grant. But again, we'll have to look at the risk assessments on your other programs. Next slide, please. So you might wonder, what's so important and what are my requirements for reporting on my CFO? So it is prepared by you. It's not something your auditors can prepare for you. It is something that you need to have prepared ahead of time and ready when we do the audit. Be as thorough and accurate as you can, because that drives all of the determinations. Because if your numbers change on your federal schedule, then that's going to change what the dollar amounts are that we're looking at for your Type A and Type B programs. And so you want to make sure you've listed your individual federal programs by federal agency, your name of your pass-through. So you'll have your federal agency, your pass-through agency, you'll have your total awards expended for each one. And you have to also report on this schedule the amount that you're passing through to a subrecipient. So that is all included in your federal expenditures. And so you'll see here, I provide an example on the screen for a CFA example for COVID-19 expenditures. The acts require that COVID-19 precede the name of the program. I know that this is not your program, but it was an example that the AICPA included in one of their trainings. So we borrowed the example for this training, just so you could see what that would look like. In addition, that COVID-19 identifier has to be in your data collection form, has to be identified there when you put your program in. And also, as auditors, if we have a finding, which we hope we don't, but if we do have a finding, we have to also precede that with the COVID-19 identifier. You also have we have notes to the federal schedule. And so those notes talk about many different things, from your basis of accounting to just things that you want to make sure that are included. There are some things that your pass-through may require to be included in those notes. Now, our office puts together some examples to kind of help our clients, and we think that it might be useful for you on our website under our reference materials, examples of what a CFO will look like, what your notes would look like. And we've tried to incorporate anything that we know is a mandatory disclosure or optional, even at that we feel would be useful for someone looking at your federal schedule to have a clear understanding of what you're trying to report. So, we suggest that maybe you take a look at that and see. We also have examples of the corrective action plan and schedule prior audit findings, which are also Auditee required schedules we're going to talk about. All right, so there are some programs that you receive. Sorry, I got ahead of you there, Michaela. You can stay there. There are some programs that you may receive directly, and some that you may be a pass-through. From the federal schedules I looked at, through most boards, you received most of your monies through OMAS, and so you don't often have direct awards. But if you do have a direct award, you have to identify it as being direct. All right, so here is the compliance supplement. This is issued by the Office of Management and Budget, and it's the federal agency, and they issue this annually, and we are required to use this when we plan and perform our single audits. And so I provided a link here in a few slides where you can go out and take a look at this, and so you'll know, what the expectations are. And so it includes audit objectives and our suggested audit procedures, and we have to fine tune those for what your pass-through, what OMAS requires as well. And it tells us specifically what we are required to test for. Now, we can evaluate for materiality if a certain procedure or a compliance requirement or even a procedure if it's material, and decide if we don't need to test it. But it is rare that we have that capability to remove a procedure. It provides guidance on internal controls over compliance, which we are required to look at, and suggested audit objectives and procedures for other awards that are not listed in the compliance supplement. So while it's very comprehensive, it doesn't include every single program that the federal government puts out. And so there are some general guidelines for us to follow as auditors, and you as recipients for when they're not specifically detailed in that compliance supplement. There are 12, as you see listed here on your screen, compliance requirements, but not all 12 are applicable to every single program you may receive. And so we do suggest that you consult with your grant award or even your awarding agency to make sure you're clear on which of these compliance requirements apply to the programs that you have. Oh, I lost myself. So in this, last year, the federal agency started identifying 6 that have to be tested. In previous year, we had to test all 12 requirements. Now that the federal government requires each agency to go through and identify at least 6 that they feel need tested each year. And so that can change by year. And also the activities allowed and unallowed and the allowable costs and cost principles, they consider 1. So it may actually end up being 7. There are a few times where they're not all applicable to every program. You won't even hit the top 6. So it's important for you to know which ones that are going to be tested. And but regardless of what's tested, you're still, of course, all the compliance requirements apply. All right, next slide, please. So we talked about the compliance supplement being issued in 2 parts. And so we have the annual compliance supplement. This year it was issued in August. Each year they try to get sooner and sooner, but of course, COVID has thrown a lot of things off. So that also delayed them just a little bit. They've been trying to get done in the summer. And so now we're going to have a COVID-19 specific addendum. that are, of course, specific to those COVID-19 programs. It's now expected closer to the end of November. We did hear last Friday that the target date now is November 19th. And so as auditors, if we're in auditing your boards, any of the boards that are 6/30, we have 5 that we know of that are 6/30 fiscal year ends. For those particular mental health boards, we can't test your COVID programs or programs that had programs or had additional fundings or flexibilities until we receive that addendum and to even know what we're going to be required to test. And so it was originally promised in October, but that timeline keeps being pushed out. And so we did get to see a vet draft, but we anticipate, based on some of the discussions following that draft, that is going to change significantly. So it might be necessary, depending on when that timing of it comes out, and then we have to evaluate it and develop the testing tools for the auditors and anybody that has a CPA firm that does their audit, either as a separate audit organization or even as if you're reported as part of a county, then we all have to follow the same procedure. So they're going to have to do that same process. A lot of times they do use what we call our FACRs. They're our federal testing forms. And so it kind of helps keep us all on the same page. But it will make it very challenging because we're, we can now test the federal schedule, but we can't necessarily do a lot of our testing until then. So you might find that any of those that are 6/30 entities, that the auditors may recommend that what they call dual date. And so we would issue your financial section of the audit first, get your financial statement opinion, your what we call the GAGAS letter, which is for compliance and internal control in your financial statements, and then subsequently issue your single audit portion, which for 6/30 entities is due March 31st. And at this point in time, they have not extended that deadline past March 31st, but we do know that the AICPA is pushing very hard for the federal government to extend that deadline because it becomes very tight trying to test all the programs and get all of the single audits out by March 31st. 1231 entities were given a extension to the end of this year, but unfortunately for 6/30 entities, 6/30/20, they were not. So we're hopeful that that comes through soon. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the reports that you'll see. When you have a single audit, then there are certain requirements that we have to report. And so of course we'll have included as part of our audit report, we include your CFA, we include your notes to your CFA, corrective action plan, schedule prior audit findings. And so specific to that federal schedule, that CFA, we have to render an opinion on whether or not it's fairly stated in all material respects with your financial statement. So the activity that's reported on your financial statement, how that ties into your federal schedule is very important. And so having that solid, accurate, thorough CFA is so important. We've seen a lot of times, and human error happens all the time. We make them too. And so, when they're adjusted, then that adjusts all the testing and it just results in additional audit costs, which we try to avoid it if at all possible. There are 4 different types of opinions that we might issue on that federal schedule. You could have on your compliance. So we go on past the federal schedule and we're going to be testing your compliance. The federal government requires that we render an opinion on your compliance. We also look at your internal control, but we don't opine on that, but we do opine on your compliance. And so there are 4 different types of compliance opinions that we issue, and that's unmodified, which is the best. That means you have a clean opinion. You might have some comments, but you overall are in compliance. You could also have a qualified or adverse or disclaimer, and they just escalate just based on the audit evidence available and the compliance, how pervasive it is to your program. We also have a schedule of findings, and in that schedule of findings, it includes both your financial statement, maybe material weakness, significant deficiencies and non-compliance, but also your single audit. So it's an all-encompassing schedule of findings. And then we have a management letter. And the management letter is anything that's immaterial or that we still feeling necessary to bring to management's attention. Now, the AICPA requirements are very specific as to what we have to report in the schedule of findings, what meets the criteria of a material weakness, a significant deficiency, or a material non-compliance. And so do the single audit requirements. CUG is very, very specific. So you know, there are guidelines that we follow in order to determine how to report those. Next slide, please. All right, the schedule of findings, here's some of the detail that's required for the single audit findings. And this is not required for our GAGAS findings, our financial statement findings. This is required for any single audit only. So it has to include the federal program name and CFDA number, the name of the federal agency or pass-through, the criteria in which the finding is based, if the finding has been issued in a prior year, any control deficiencies, which will be your material weaknesses and your significant deficiencies, and your non-compliance, and any views of responsible officials. So when we develop our findings, we have a discussion with your boards and with management and those charged with governance. And then we ask for any responses that you may have. And those that are included in the schedule of findings, we can put those responses in the report. So we do give you an opportunity to respond to that. We are also required for single audits, in addition to the material weaknesses, significant deficiencies, and material non-compliance, we're also required to report any question costs. And so if we're looking at a program and we're testing those expenditures and we run across something that maybe wasn't quite within the program guidelines, and looking at your results, and Rich is going to talk about some audit trends, there have been very few single audit findings. Unfortunately, COVID, the way that the funding has rolled out, we are hesitant because we're hoping it doesn't result in additional findings, but it's hard to comply or at least understand what the requirements are at the time the expenditure is made. So we do ask that you make sure you go back and revisit anything that had additional guidance to come out, talk to your awarding agencies if something has changed. And so, but we are required to report those question costs, and then we refer those, they go to the agencies. They actually are required as part of their pass-through requirements to go over, your single audit. Next slide, please. These are two other auditee required reports. So your boards need to make sure that you're preparing a corrective action plan for any findings that are in the schedule of findings. It has to be on your letterhead, and the federal government requires it. And you have to provide the names of the contacts responsible for the action, the corrective action plan, and the anticipated completion date in that corrective action. And I've included a reference here for you to the uniform guidance, so you'll know specifically what the requirements of that are. And so if you have a finding that's presented to you, I suggest that you go ahead and start drafting that corrective action plan with the necessary information. The schedule of prior audit findings also is something that we have to audit. And so you would prepare that. So if you have a finding in your last audit report, you'll want to prepare that schedule. The reference is the same as the corrective action plan. They're together. And you have to report all the findings included in your prior year schedule of findings, not necessarily your management letter, although your federal agency may follow up on that. But you have to identify in there whether they're fully corrected, partially corrected, not corrected. And if it's partially or not corrected, the schedule must also include the reasons why and any planned corrective action or partial corrective action that's going to be taken. And in addition, it also has to include the year in which the finding originally occurred. We don't have a lot of repeat findings. People try really hard to comply. And so, because, the more money that you can use, the more services that can be provided through your agencies. And that's just so important, especially now. All right, next slide, please. The data collection form I don't know how many have heard of it. Usually that's one that we work through with your fiscal group here. So maybe not everybody on the training has heard about it, but this form actually is filed with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse and has a very tight timeline. And so it has to be filed within the earlier of 30 days after receipt of the report, auditor's report, or 9 months after the end of the audit period. And that form is very important because whether or not it's filed on time affects your entity risk assessment that we have to do as part of the uniform guidance in order to determine what percentage that we have to test. And so there are different parts. It includes information related, specifically from your CFA, from your notes, from your schedule of findings. It has information from both your financial audit and your single audit. And there are parts for both the auditor and the auditee, so you'll have a part in that as well. And there's a certification that both parts, your board and the auditors will have to complete before this can be filed. Next slide, please. So there are 4 acts passed providing the majority of the COVID funding. So now that we've talked about what uniform guidance requires, let's talk just a little bit about your funding. And so these 4 were passed, driving that funding. And again, our office put together a spreadsheet trying to identify, and the AICPA did as well, and we double checked ours to theirs also, trying to identify to help you all know what is going to be required. We did identify on that spreadsheet that we thought your block grant might have received flexibilities or waivers or additional funding. But when I spoke with OMOS on Friday, they confirmed that it did not. So we will update the spreadsheet for that to remove it and add the additional pieces that have come to our attention in preparing this training. So it's really great to be able to do these type of trainings that helps us learn as well. Next slide, please. So here are the fundings. This is straight from OMOS. I spoke with Vicki and I spoke with Dwayne. Dwayne is with fiscal, and I'm sure you all are aware. I had not met them either before, but both were so informative. And so Dwayne was able to provide the CFDA numbers and whether or not these were new programs. And so your FEMA Crisis Counseling and Assistance Programs, the ISP, that was a short-term program and that has already ended. But your RSP is now underway, and there is a required training that they told me about on 11/19, 11/20 for the recipients of these monies. I did find that there's lots of information on OMOS's website. I didn't find anything specific to the FEMA programs, but the lead on those programs did email me the necessary information, so I was able to pull out the information for this slide. So when you're doing your federal schedule, make sure that you're identifying those as COVID fundings. Both of these are new programs, and the CFDA related CFDA number that are listed here. If your program information, your grant agreements show something different, then definitely let us know. But again, this is straight from OMOS. So for your SOAR, your State Opioid Response, SOAR 2.0, it was not a new program. That is actually an expansion of your 1.0. And so it expanded the current services. And so you want to make sure you know what those additional services are and how the flexibilities that they've provided. I did find on OMOS's website not only a frequently asked questions for your SOAR, but I also found a flexibilities information to explain how those flexibilities can be used under the program as an expansion of your 1.0. So you might check their website out for that information. The emergency grant is the one that Vicki, that I spoke with on Friday, is the program lead for. And this is also a new program. The period runs from April 20th, 2020 to August 19th of 21. Now, I found on OMOS's website that Vicki had been part of a video training. And she talked, and I listened to that video training to kind of get a feel for your programs. I think that's very important if we're, for us to know what your programs are, but also to learn them well, to try to, provide you the best training that we can. And she talks about that it didn't change the original 4 services provided. It in fact, it just enhances those current services. And she talked about on that video presentation that things like food or meals, transportation or childcare for employment, rent, cleaning supplies, and so forth would not be covered under that program, but it does support the recovery housing, peer support, and so forth. So your grant agreement that you have with them your sub-grant agreement should detail everything that is allowable. But again, the money was flowing out faster than sometimes the guidance. So make sure that you've gone back and evaluated what expenditures maybe have been made. All right, so I also did find on their website a frequently asked questions as well for that emergency grant. You'll want to make sure that you look for and read through. Had some very good information. All right, so CARES Act. There actually was 2 pieces to the CARES Act. Originally, there was most recently, there was a $10 million mental health allotment provided by the controlling board. And so when I spoke with Dwayne on Friday, he mentioned that there was an additional 1.5 that was passed for education. Now, some of the other programs, like I talked, like your emergency program, those are longer period of time, but the CARES Act is very tight. The timeline is that the expenditures have to be incurred by December 30th. It's tough to do when it's November 9th and the money is just, in process. So I did, Fonda sent me the CARES Act information sheet, the fact sheet, and it was very helpful. It has a lot of the information that you'll want to make sure that you've looked at to know what you can spend the funding on. And so one of the things you have to keep in mind is the CARES Act. There are 3 prongs to that CARES Act. And so you want to make sure that you've evaluated those 3 prongs. Are they necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency? Were they not accounted for in the budget that was passed as of March 27th and were incurred during the period that begins March 1st and ends December 30th? And incurred under the CARES Act means that the funds have not necessarily that you've expended them by that day, but that the services or products have been services rendered or the things that you've bought received. So it's not encumbered. That it actually has to be what they call incurred, services rendered and goods received. There were 6 direct recipients in Ohio. There were 5 counties at Cuyahoga, Franklin, Hamilton, Montgomery, and Summit. And then the city of Columbus for CARES Act dollars. And they actually subbed out some of their monies to other agencies. Now, I'm not sure if you did receive any of those funding, but if you did, they fall under the same requirements of the CARES Act, but specific to that subgrant. So you want to make sure that if you did receive some funding from these direct recipients, that you have accounted for them accordingly. Let's see here. All right, so based on the funding summary that Fonda sent, there are 3 primary areas for the CARES Act funding for that 10 million allocation: visibility and access to services, psychiatric, inpatient, and crisis care, and it supports for those in recovery. So, and it talks about how the monies will be allocated as well. So you'll want to make sure that you also, before you start spending the education dollars when they're received, that you have the guidelines for that. And I totally understand that, it's extremely tight timeline. Your services that you provide, that the services that are provided through your agency, what your agency does is so very important. So hopefully it's going to be set up to where you're able to have those services provided. Next slide, please. OMOS asked me to include exactly what, said up front that Fonda mentions, that the program and funding questions should be directed to the program or fiscal leads that are listed in that table B. And they did ask that you check that table B on a consistent basis or very regular basis for updates. They're soon going to be updating that for the CARES Act, so it's very important that you have that information. They did ask that any questions you have, you send directly to them. Of course, if they're included and we're not able to get to them, if they are programmatic decisions, we'll be glad to maybe pass them on to a central contact point, but they did ask that, you know, your specific questions you do relay to them. Next slide, please. All right, so the next few slides that we have are about testing and documentation. You know, it's very important for, especially in this COVID funding. You know, we have to understand that sometimes the controls changed, and because we had stay-at-home orders or teleworking, you know, and documentation is the key. How did your process change? So the testing that as auditors that we do might look differently for the first 9 months if you're a 630 entity, or the first 3 months if you're a 1231 entity. Than it would the rest of the year because of the sudden shift. And so because we're required to test controls and try to rely on controls, that's important that, so we may have 2 separate testing procedures that we have to do, because the results of that control work is so important, because that drives how much compliance testing that we have to do. And then, so, you know, if you have it well documented, we'll evaluate that document, determine if we can we'll do some tests of what we call implementation, and we'll try to do what we can to rely on those controls. And, you know, we'll look at, did that key control change? And by the key control, we mean the control in place to ensure the compliance with the requirement. So again, documentation is so important. Next slide, please. Now, there's separate accountability. You need to refer to your grant terms and conditions. So for federal awards, there requires a separate accountability. And so what that looks like may differ, but you need to make sure that you have separately accounted for the receipt and expenditure. So if it's an existing program, it's probably going to be a sub-fund or special cost center of that current program. So you can track that COVID activity separately and be able to report it on the federal schedule and any of the reporting requirements that you do have for that program. But if it's a new program, you're probably looking at a new fund. And so, but that's something you have to evaluate under GASB Codification 1300, whether or not that meets a separate fund requirement. I know that some of your boards report everything in the general fund, some have special revenue funds, and each entity has to evaluate that GASB to determine how to report, but we anticipate most of these will be a separate fund if they're a newer program. Next slide, please. All right, so this has been a huge question in our office, reimbursing of prior year expenditures, specifically for those that have a 6/30 fiscal year end. And we have an old FEMA bulletin out there, and you'll see a reference at the bottom of the slide, 98013 on our website, that provides reimbursement guidance. We've also pulled that into our compliance supplement. I provided the specific page here on the implementation guide. It's page 50. And we anticipate most people have followed that. There was some concern that whether or not the transfer option would violate law, Ohio Revised Code transfer laws. And so we've included some guidance in our frequently asked questions to try to help address this. And so, we prefer that you have a reduction of expenditure or reduction of a prior year expenditure line item to move those eligible expenditures out of that fund, because, a lot of this COVID funding can go back to March 1st to reimburse expenditures. And so, but some of the accounting systems don't have that capability, and each differs. And so, if your system doesn't allow, if your financial system doesn't allow for it, then the last resort, use a transfer option. But we do ask that you work with your legal counsel to make sure that the transfer laws are not violated. And of course, when you go to report your financial statements, you want to look and see, because those activities being recorded as reductions of expenditures or even transfers can maybe overstate your financial activity, and it may need adjusted for reporting. So if your system doesn't allow you to make those adjustments in your financial statements, alert your auditors to that ahead of time, and so they'll know to be aware that you've identified that in your financial review process. And so those of you that have a 6/30 fiscal year end, for your boards, if you choose to go back to March 1st to adjust, their timing is important. So I would recommend that you do that as quickly as you can. And so that way your auditors have a final and complete CFA. I understand your CARES Act dollars are just coming out the door, which may complicate things. So if you do choose to go back to March 1st, you have to make sure that you've accounted for those in your financial statement and your CFA, your federal schedule, accurately. And so some adjustments may need to be made because auditors will need to reevaluate that major program determination. Next slide, please. All right, subgranting. You need to make sure you know your responsibilities. All this money is flowing out. Some may be going out to some of your community partners as subgrants, and you already do that now through some of your programs. And so you need to make sure you know your responsibility, not only those that you're a subgrantee of, but those who you're subgranting out. And there are differing responsibilities. Your boards do sign a subgrant agreement with OMS. And so that has a lot of the information. You can even refer back to that for some of the information that you might want to pull into your own. The uniform guidance requirements for subgrants is included on this slide for your reference to be able to go back and take a look at that. The OMOS guidelines, I have here that it's on slide 22, but it's actually on slide 23. I apologize for that error. But to try to help our clients because of this money and so many subgrants happening, we put together a best practice document for when clients are doing small business programs. Now, while I know that probably won't apply to your boards, there is a piece in there that is on our website that's referenced in that advisory, but thankfully we've pulled it out and put it on our COVID page of specifically what this UG requires for subgrants. It's a great read. The link is included here on this slide, and so I would recommend that it's really well written by a girl in our office. And so if you are doing subgrants, even currently, even if it's not with your COVID dollars, I do highly recommend that you take a look at that. Next slide, please. As part of your subgranting responsibilities, you have to evaluate whether or not you have what they call a subrecipient or contract relationship. And so, if they're providing you a service, what you really want to focus on is who is responsible for the federal compliance. Even if it's one piece, even if it's one of the 12 that they're responsible for, then that makes them a subgrant. And means you're subgranting the money to them, and that you become a pass-through, and you have a lot of subrecipient responsibilities as your pass-through entity requirements. And again, I've included the references here so you can go take a look at those. But you have a responsibility what's supposed to be included in your subawards and what your responsibility is in monitoring those subrecipients. And so you also know what OMOS is doing to monitor each of your agencies. So it's very important to go through and really think about it. It's really function over form. So even if you have an agreement and you say, well, in my agreement, it says that, they're not responsible for anything, or they're responsible for this or that of the requirements, it's actually what's happening. And so that'll be evaluated to determine if maybe, inadvertently you are pushing a compliance requirement to a subrecipient, which is, it happens. And so just go through and make an evaluation occasionally to make sure that you're still understanding what each of one's responsibilities are. Next slide, please. This is a link to your financial and compliance audit guidelines. So you still need to comply with the federal requirements, terms and conditions, but the federal money doesn't lose its identity because it goes from one person to one agency or organization to another. And so identifying whose responsibility for that compliance will help you understand what your responsibilities are. But I thought you'd like to have a link to this, which you probably already do, but just in case. Next slide, please. This is what our website looks like for our COVID-19 resources. The read more red is where you would click on to go to the resources that are on the next slide. Next slide, thank you. And so I've starred 3 specific ones here. So the one on the left is a spreadsheet that has all the funding that we've identified. The frequently asked questions is in the middle star, and it is updated probably weekly. And then the bottom right, there's a red star for That is the subgrant guidelines that I just spoke about. That really details what you need to do as a subrecipient, or if you're subbing out your dollars to another agency. Next slide, please. Here are some resources that are available. In addition to what's available on our website, the uniform guidance, there's even some frequently asked questions to help understand the uniform guidance. Sometimes interpreting law is very difficult. Reference to OMB, which is who writes the compliance supplement, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, where you file your single audit. The AICPA Government Quality Center, they've sent out a lot of resources, especially the, what is affected during the COVID-19 period. The GASB Technical Bulletin that was issued to keep in mind when you're preparing your financial statements. And then, of course, U.S. Treasury CARES Act guidance and frequently asked questions. They've got a lot of guidance out there, and it changes almost every week. So, keep an eye on, especially for the particular funding that you have. Next slide, please. All right, so now I'm going to turn this over to Rich. We did go a few minutes longer than I had anticipated. I apologize for that, but we have plenty of time. So I'm going to turn over to Rich. Rich, as you know, has presented to your group before. He also helped update your association's behavioral health handbook. We are very grateful to have Rich and his vast knowledge in the Center for Audit Excellence. So he has done great work with us. So I will turn it over to you now, Rich, to carry forward with the audit specific information.
Okay, thank you very much, Rhonda. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to spend the rest of the time mainly talking about common citations, recommendations that we've seen in some of the audits in general, not just federal. But before I get into that, I want to actually show you some information on our website that I think is very helpful. I'll probably spend 15, maybe even 20 minutes going over part of that. I see a few questions have come into the chat, and I think some of the stuff I may be showing you will help answer a few of those questions. And I can see by some of the questions, some of you are already familiar with some of the information that's available on our website. So I'll see if I can get into our website. If you go to www.ohioauditor.gov, this is our main website that'll come up. You'll see the main home page. And on the first page, as Rhonda showed you, there's some information about the COVID-19 is available here right off the bat. So you can click on the read more, and it'll bring up the page that she was showing you with all this information. And you can see a few of these say more. So there is a lot more information here than what you're seeing already. If you click on more, it does open up, and there's a lot of detailed information in here. So we have a few people in our group that spend a ton of time putting this together and monitoring and updating it. It does change very frequently. What's out here today, you could go out tomorrow and it may change again. So it is important that you go out and review and check and see what kind of information is out here. So if you have some time, go out here and look and see what's available. Also, as you have some free time, there is a ton of information that's out here. As you go through some of these drop-down boxes on audits, local government, open government, resources, contacting our office, there is a lot of stuff here. So play around with it a little bit, look and see what's out there. There's a lot of things that may be very, very helpful. One of the things I wanted to show you is our Ohio Compliance Supplement. And when we get back into the actual slides, there are some links to it. Although I checked this morning, some of the links work, some of the links don't work, but the names and addresses are there. But I kind of indicated on the slides as to where to go to and how to find things. But if you go through resources and publications and manuals, it has our big main list. You see a lot of publications up here at the top. A lot of neat information in these. If any of you have school-age kids or grandkids, there's some books here on along the Ohio Trail, or Ohio Lands book gives them a lot of neat history about the state of Ohio. And as we go down the list, you can see a lot of different publications, fact sheets, reports, manuals. You'll see down here, as we mentioned earlier, the The Behavioral Health Authority's handbook that we helped update a few years ago, that is available here on our website. You can access that. On the right-hand column, up towards the top here, Ohio Compliance Supplement Manual. This is part of what I wanted to go over. We do testing with the Ohio Revised Code and Compliance Supplement every year. Not only us, but I know some of you have private firms. We call them IPAs, independent public accounting firms, or CPA firms that do your audits. It doesn't matter if you have Auditor of State auditors or IPA auditors. We all follow the same audit standards, and they're also required to test these Ohio Compliance Supplement Manuals. And they do the same testing with the federal programs as well as we do. These are set up by year. They do get revised and changed some from year to year. There's 2020, 2019, and they go on down. We're currently in the final stages of putting a 2021 version that should be out here very shortly. There are three main chapters that we always test: the direct laws in Chapter 1, indirect laws and statutory mandated test, and stewardship. Anything that's in these chapters that is applicable, and a lot of things in it may not be applicable to you, but we do test all the applicable ones. There are some optional procedures. The optional procedures aren't done on every audit, but there are certain audits on a sample basis, so we test some of the optional procedures, or if we know that there were problems in the past with certain compliance items, we may test the optional procedures also. The supplemental implementation guide is at the very beginning. Click on that, it'll open it. Shows a lot of information about how our compliance supplement works. I always point this out because I've always told my clients that you can find out ahead of time before the auditors come through the door what they're going to test compliance-wise. You can look at this compliance supplement, you can see the steps, see the procedures, know exactly what we're going to look for, what we're going to test for, make sure that you're complying with it. Despite what you may believe, auditors don't like writing up lots of comments. That's a lot of extra work. We have to do a lot of extra documenting to write up comments, go through multiple review stages, and generally you're not happy when you get comments from us. So we actually want you to do things right and proper, and we hope that when you do get comments, you're proactive and take steps to fix and correct any comments that you had from the prior year. If you look down towards the bottom of this index on Exhibit 5, the legal matrix, and this is set up, you can click on any of these items within this table of contents and it will take you directly to it. So if you go to the legal matrix, there's some information about it, and then there's a link to an Excel spreadsheet. We'll try to go to that Excel spreadsheet, hopefully, yep. And all the entities are listed across the top. So you would fall under the joint mental health district. Anything that we think applies to any of the mental health and recovery boards, the ADAMH boards, would all go under this. Anything that has a check mark shows that these corresponding steps will apply to you. There are a number of footnotes in here. You do need to check the footnotes. Anything that doesn't have a check mark doesn't apply to you. So you'll see here at the beginning, a lot of these compliance items do apply. We get down to county children's services, conveyance and contracts, which are for school districts. These don't apply to you.
And Rich, we can't see the spreadsheet.
Can't see the spreadsheet?
No, unfortunately not.
You're only sharing your web browser, so you might have to stop sharing and then reshare with your Excel screen.
Okay. Okay, does it show now? Can you see the matrix now? Okay.
Yes.
So everything under the mental health district is going to apply to you. All the steps are down here towards the left. One means that it's from Chapter 1. We have all the Chapter 1 steps. And I'll go down into Chapter 2. Chapter 3, and so forth. At the very bottom are all the footnotes. So as I said, anything that has a footnote by it's very important that you read that, check that, make sure if it may apply to you or not. So let's go back out to the compliance supplement. Okay, we're back to the compliance supplement. You see chapter 1. So as you find out from that spreadsheet, if a particular section applies to you, as we go down here, the very first step on annual appropriation measures, you can go right to that. There's a brief summary of the actual requirement, what the revised code says that you're supposed to apply with, what the various minimum requirements are. There's a section where we document controls to ensure you have controls in place. And then at the end of each section, there's a section of suggested audit procedures, compliance substantive procedures. And these questions are exactly what the auditors are probably going to ask you or look for when they're out there doing the audit to make sure if it applies to you or not. It goes into section 1.2 and so forth. Let's go out and take a look at the bulletins, the same place we found the compliance supplement. Down towards the very bottom is a list of technical bulletins from 1995 through 2020. If there's any particular bulletins you've heard about or had people talk about in the past, if you want to find those, you can click on that. They're set up by year. Actually one that's new it's a new bulletin this year, but not a new topic. Fraud hotline, this would actually apply to you. This is kind of a refresher. This is a law and a rule that's existed all along before. I'm not going to go over that in detail. But there are two fairly new ones that I'm going to go over a little bit, and then I have some slides on them. It's new information, and the auditors are probably asking questions for the very first time. 2019-003 Ohio Sunshine Law and the Star Rating Program. Auditor Faber is pushing the transparency a lot with the government. They want government to be transparent and make sure that you're complying with the public records law, the Ohio Sunshine laws. If you haven't seen this bulletin before, go out and look at it, because I can guarantee the auditors are going to be testing for this next time in if they haven't tested it already. But the beginning part gives a lot of summary of what the Open Meetings Act is, what the Public Records Act is, what the Sunshine laws are, what you need to do at a minimum to comply with. All the various laws and requirements are all listed here. At a minimum, you need to comply with the Sunshine laws. And under the compliance section, right within the bulletin, it lists out all the requirements and the testing procedures. There are 13 steps here. Some of them may not be applicable, but if they are applicable, these are the minimum amounts that you have to comply with the public records laws. After you get through those 13 requirements, there is the star rating program that we have. And we award stars, and as your auditors finish the audits, so they're going to indicate if you were compliant or not. If you were compliant at a minimum, you're going to get 1 star for meeting the Sunshine laws. If you didn't meet all the Sunshine requirements, you're going to be listed as non-compliant. Once you are compliant, if you're doing best practices and you meet 1 to 2 best practices, you get 2 stars. If you meet 3 to 4, you get 3 stars. 5 or more, you get 4 stars. The best practices are just best practices. These are things that you must do, but they're things to be more transparent, to be more open government, that we want you to strive to try to meet these, but they're not required that you have to meet those. The best practices are all listed here below, that you have methods and forms of communicating your public records back. As you go through those, there's about 7 of them here. They give some samples and examples. They're not all inclusive. Read through these more closer later. I had somebody call me shortly after this came out. They were all concerned on number 7 here, that you have an online presence, and that you're making things that are routinely requested available on your website. And there's a listing of some examples, and again, they're not all inclusive. And one is compensation of public officials. And they said, well, you mean we have to put our compensation of public officials out on our website? Well, no, you don't have to. That is public record. And if somebody came in and wanted to see it, you would have to provide it to them. But again, these are just samples and examples. And it's really to help make things easier for you with the public records request. If there are certain things that you know people come in all the time and request, and you put it on your website, when they make the request, just refer them to your website. Say, hey, go out to our website. Here's where it's located at. It's all done and over with. So we see some entities probably get very, very few public records requests, and some entities get a lot. It just depends where you're located at, what type of entity you are. And then after this, there's also some frequently asked questions and answers within the bulletin. And there's some example forms towards the end that shows you a little bit on the various types of forms to set up for the public records. So be aware that that bulletin is out there. And then I also want to take a quick look at one in 2018. This is on credit cards, and people may have been testing credit cards. I don't know how much that you may use or not use credit cards. 2018-003 on House Bill 312. This doesn't apply to county. So I know some of you are actually part of a county, and those that aren't part of a county, a lot of you, your fiscal agent is a county. So you may have to check or see, you may be following county rules no matter what. If the county is your fiscal agent, you may have to follow whatever the county policies and county rules are. If you have your own separate credit cards, this gives a lot of the guidance that House Bill 312 required on written policies and procedures over the credit cards. You have to set up different models. There's either a custody and control model or a compliance officer model, and it walks you through what the various requirements are. And again, these are items that are in our compliance supplement that is fairly new and recent that we're looking at a little bit closer when the auditors are out there testing. So you may have some questions over credit cards. If any of you have debit cards, a debit card is definitely a no-no. If you have a debit card, make sure you close that out. Only law enforcement entities are allowed to have debit cards. You can only have credit cards. Also available, which is where I saw some people asking questions about. It's really up here under IPA resources and under some of their reference materials. There's some information on single audit practice aids and report shells. The very top one here are federal award compliance control records, or we use the acronym of FACR. We designed this for testing our various federal programs. We make this available for the IPAs. They can use it. They're not required to use it. And this basically summarizes what's in the OMB Compliance Supplement. And this is also updated from year to year. There's 2020 and 2019 and so forth. See when they've been revised. As we update and post these, most of these are for school districts right now that are on a June 30th year end. We'll look at 2019. Probably the most common one that applied to a lot of you is CFDA number 93.959, block grants for prevention and treatment of substance abuse. Again, like the other ones, you can click on, well, I'm going to have to probably unshare and go to it.
You can also share your desktop, Rich, so you can switch back and forth between tabs if that would be easier.
Okay. I think this is the only one I need to go to again. Okay, the beginning part of this walks you through some of the various requirements. There's a table of contents. And all those requirements, those 12 requirements that Rhonda referred to, allowable cost, cash management, matching level of effort, those are all in here. And it walks you through what the requirements are, what the various guidelines are, program-specific requirements. And it eventually gets down to suggested audit procedures and what the auditors are doing. As I said, this is created from straight from the OMB Compliance Supplement. We take the OMB Compliance Supplement, we take the information from there, we put it in this, it kind of summarizes and puts it all together. We create these factors for the most common types of federal programs and ones that are tested the most often. So as we get into more of the COVID programs and some of these other programs, I know somebody was asking about the SOR 2.0 program. If we find that's going to be a commonly tested program, we'll probably create a factor somewhere down the road. For some of the smaller programs that don't get tested very often, we may not create a factor until somebody requests it. But if you need to find specific stuff, if you go out to that compliance supplement, and again, only the first parts there, the COVID-19 hasn't been released, you can look up your CFDA number in the OMB compliance supplement if you need to find your specific steps and requirements that apply to that grant. If it's not already in a grant agreement or someplace else that you're already aware of what needs to apply to you, that compliance supplement will provide all that information. But back. But again, if you know you've had some of these programs in the past, you can look up the program from here. So like the 93.959, although it hasn't been updated for this year, a lot of these programs, except for COVID stuff that you're going to run across, aren't going to change a whole lot from one year to another. But almost like the compliance supplement, this is kind of a way to check ahead of time what's going to apply for you on your particular federal program before the auditors come in and test that federal program. So, let's go back to I have one more thing to show you here quick related to the credit cards before I get out of the website. In the optional compliance supplement, like I said, possibly this 012 section is going to relate more to county credit card procedures. And again, you can go to that compliance supplement. It'll tell you what the rules are if you're following the county rules for credit cards. If you're not following that, or you have your own credit card procedures, the section 022 will tell you everything for all the other entities. You can see here counties refer to 012. All the other different entities are listed below here. So I think that's all I wanted to point out on the website. Michaela, if you can bring the slideshow back up, we'll go back to slide 28. Here's the main website for the Auditor of State, the Ohio Compliance Supplement. As I said, look under resources, then look at publications and manuals, and then you'll see that Ohio Compliance Supplement on the right-hand column. You'll see a lot of the other information there. Go to the next slide. And again, to find your applicable sections, look for the implementation guide and the Ohio Compliance Supplement. Look for Exhibit 5, the legal matrix. It's towards the very bottom part of your table of contents. And then the items that are going to apply to you will be under the column of Joint Mental Health District. The bulletins, as I mentioned, are also listed there down towards the bottom under those publications and resources. Once you get into the bulletins, are sorted from year. So if you're looking for 2019-003 on the STARS program, if you're looking for 2018-003 on the credit cards, if you're looking for any other ones that you think may apply to you, you can find those bulletins, find that detailed information there. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So as I already went over on the website, that was kind of the current stuff that I wanted to point out. The Bulletin 2019-003, which is in our compliance supplement under that section 2-23, is the Ohio Sunshine Laws and the new star rating program and how all of that works. I didn't want to take time to go into the compliance supplement for that part, but if you look at that section 2-23, it basically mirrors what the bulletin is. It shows all the same information, same steps. And keep in mind, again, as I said, these compliance supplement gets updated from year to year to year. So there was no guarantee when the 2021 version comes out that the section's still going to be the same as 2-23. That could change slightly, but the information will still be located or be in there somewhere. You'll be able to find it in the table of contents. Also, the Bulletin 2018-003 on the credit cards. And it's in the optional procedures 012 for counties and 022 if you're not following the county procedures, but you're allowed to have your own credit card procedures. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. Kind of a summary of some of the research that we did. If we counted right, give or take one or two, we came up with 51 total boards or districts, mental health board and districts. 21 actually have their own separate audits that are separate from counties. Most of those are joint boards that are multiple counties. But as I said, I noticed on quite a few of them, you still may have one of those counties or your actual fiscal agent for handling a lot of your recording your transactions. So the other 30 that don't have separate audits means you're part of the actual county, and when we come in and audit that particular county, your district and your board would just be part of that whole county audit and part of those funds. So we took a look at those 21 districts. Majority of them, 16 of them, have December 31st year ends. 5 of them, and I noticed most of those 5 are over towards the western part of the state, have June 30th year ends, and I've noticed a few of you are in the middle of having audits done right now. Also looked at the financial statement formats and how you're filing your financial statements. It's about half and half. 11 of the 21 do what we call AOS regulatory cash basis statements. 9 of you do OACBHA statements or other comprehensive basis of accounting. These are still cash basis, but they're put in a format that's similar to GAAP reporting and GAAP accounting. And we have one out there that we audit that is full GAAP accounting and GAAP financial statements. For the most part, it looks like pretty much everybody has had federal uniform guidance single audits in the past. I think I only had one that I noticed that didn't have a recent federal audit, but I did see that they had federal audits in the past. So that $750,000 limit, some of you are just above and just below. So in the past, some of you may have had single audits one year and then maybe not again in another year. We would anticipate or think with the COVID-19 money and potentially getting a lot more federal funding, probably all of you are going to continue to be federal funds and federal single audits in the future. Oh, somebody I noticed asked a question. I can kind of answer it quick as we're going through here on that SOR 2.01 program. If we're saying that that's going to be COVID-19, that's where some of these programs, some of it may be COVID money and some of it may not be COVID money. And Rhonda went over an example early on with kind of the federal schedule format where you may have to identify what portion is COVID and what portion isn't COVID. And that's something you're going to have to find out from their grantor agencies or when they're sending the money to you. Hopefully they're going to identify that. So you potentially going forward could have some programs that are totally 100% COVID-19 monies. Some may have no COVID-19 monies, and some may be a mixture. Part may be COVID-19 and part may not be COVID-19. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. From those 21 audits, kind of went through to find some of the common comments, and I looked all the way back to 2015. So I went from 2015 up through 2019. Of those 21 entities, I have completely separate audits. For those of you that are part of a county, your comments are buried within the county reports. So it was pretty much impossible for me to be able to identify or pull out anything that may apply to you that was in that county report, although probably similar type comments would apply. And as I went through these, probably majority of these comments we see on a lot of our other entities are very common type comments. Again, keep in mind, we want you to learn, we want you to correct and fix things. We did notice as I was going through items that most people were very proactive on correcting and fixing comments that they've had in the past. Sometimes because of timing, they don't get corrected right away because by the time we finish your audit, we're already 6 months or more into the next year. So sometimes you get some repeated comments because you haven't had time to fix that. We understand that, we know that. Try to give you credit when we know that you have fixed it, but we do want you to try to take care of them. If you're having internal control type comments, an internal control comment isn't necessarily saying that you're lacking controls or don't have controls. That could be, but it might be a matter that maybe we think you can expand on controls or do a little bit more better with controls. So always take those are recommendations, suggestions, and ideas and things that we think you can improve on your controls, do a little bit better with controls. So don't always take comments as being negative. They're meant to be helpful. They're meant for you to try to do things right. As I said, we do want you to correct and do things correctly. We hope you don't see findings for recovery. Findings for recoveries you don't want to have means monies are unaccounted for or missing, and potentially monies need to be paid back. Federal question costs with some of the federal testing. We may be questioning to the federal agencies that some of the monies may not have been spent properly or allowable. You don't want to see those. I didn't see any with some of the audits that I've looked back in the past, so that's good that you've had those. So just because you're getting comments doesn't necessarily mean something bad's going to happen to you, but it's items that we need to report and make you aware of. As I said, I looked through some of the reports, did see people did try to correct and fix a lot of things, didn't really see comments dropping a lot, but it's because of a lot of new things coming in and new requirements coming in. On average, I saw between 8 to 11 entities had comments each year. Total comments range from about 18 to 24. So there weren't a lot. There weren't a lot of real bad ones, which is good that you are taking steps to correct and fix things. So the first item here are the audit adjustments on financial statements. And this is our most common with any kind of an entity. If we're doing a school, a city, a township, a county, whatever it may be, because we're auditing your actual financial statements and we're giving an opinion if your financial statements are fairly stated. So if we find errors of things recorded in the wrong funds, of things recorded in the wrong line items, and we have to make audit adjustments to fix your financial statements to make them fairly stated, you may be getting comments that there's errors there. I think since 2015, came across about 26 different audits that had some type of a financial statement audit adjustment. And about half of those, at least 12 of them, also included GASB 54 errors. This was a new standard that came out a few years back. This is where you classify your fund balances for different restrictions. Your committed, restricted, assigned, unassigned, non-spendable type fund balances. When that was fairly new, we saw a lot of these comments, and I think most of the errors that I found were early on. I haven't found a lot of errors recently, which again means, okay, it was a new requirement, new standard. People weren't very familiar with it, made a lot of errors, but you learned, and as you went along, you improved a lot, didn't have as many errors and many problems with this. So hopefully that'll continue. A little bit of good news for the few of you out there that are AOS regulatory basis. We think after the end of this year, at least for financial reporting purposes, we're no longer going to require you to show the fund balances following GASB 54 in your financial statements. There will probably still be some footnote disclosures that you'll need to report, but you won't have to show those requirements. For those that are doing ACBOA, because ACBOA is still following GAAP and looking similar to GAAP, you do have to follow the GASB 54. But like I said, I think most people are doing this correctly now. We shouldn't have a lot of problems with it. Also, your budgetary statements, I had at least 8 audits where there were errors with the budgetary statements or the budgetary footnotes. The statements are still part of your financial statements. Your footnotes are still part of your financial statements. So if you're a regulatory where you don't have to show the budgetary statements, you still have budgetary footnotes. And if there's errors, mistakes with those budgetary amounts, we may be making audit adjustments. The schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or the CFA, or the federal schedule. We had about 12 audits that had errors and mistakes in the federal schedule. And as Rhonda indicated, it's very important that you're preparing the federal schedule accurately, properly, making sure that's complete, that nothing is missing. You're responsible for the schedule. We can give you some helpful guidance. We can try to answer some questions. We can point you in the right direction. We can help format the federal schedule or give you shells for that, but all the required information that Rhonda went over is your responsibility to gather. And the big thing we're concerned about is completeness, that everything is included that's supposed to be included and then the amounts are correct. Haven't had any problems with any of your entities, and it doesn't happen too often, but occasionally we'll issue audits and it goes back to the federal agency, and the federal agency finds that something's missing. They notify you, and sometimes we have to reopen the audit and do additional testing. So we don't have to do any additional testing because her program's missing or the correct amounts weren't reported there. So it is important that you go through, check, and make sure that it's okay. If you're getting something new financial statement wise, something new federal schedule wise, if you're not sure, call somebody, ask somebody, call one of your other fellow boards or districts. Call your IPA auditors, call our auditors. We'll try to help you out wherever we can and give you some answers. It's something I've always pointed out to my clients at pre and post audit meetings is we're there year round to provide a service for you. We don't just come in once a year for a few weeks during the audit period and then you're gone and we never see you again. If you're not sure of something, email us, call us. We'd rather you ask a question up front, try to help you where we can, have you do it right, then wait until it's too late. We come in after the fact, and then we have to make a whole bunch of audit adjustments because you didn't classify things right. Similarly, I watched a training a couple weeks ago that the Ohio Ethics Commission put on, and the lady that presented the training, kind of the same thought. She stressed to people too, if you have ethics issues, she'd rather you call the Ethics Commission and ask up front rather than waiting till afterwards, because they can try to help you up front rather than being involved in an investigation later. So kind of same thing. We want to help you so we don't have to make lots of audit adjustments after the fact. Another common issue is the non-compliance with those compliance items we went through and some of the budgetary items, and we had at least 15 audits that had some type of budgetary non-compliance. The most common is probably expenditures exceeding appropriations. We also have expenditures exceeding estimated resources or amendments to appropriations that weren't properly approved or filed properly. So make sure you're complying with all those compliance things. You can amend those budgetary items. If you know you're going to be spending more money, you need to make sure you amend your appropriations beforehand so that you don't spend the money before you have it appropriated. If you know you're going to be getting more receipts in, make sure your estimated receipts are amended and increased before you actually appropriate it so that doesn't exceed. You can go on to the next slide, please. Here are some of the federal items, and as we said, and federal can be very confusing. We expect more problems with the COVID-19, but everybody has been doing a very, very good job with federal in the past. And with a lot of other entities, this is an area where we have lots of problems, lots of issues, because it is pretty complicated and confusing. Didn't find a lot of federal problems. The most common, and this was new when uniform guidance first came out, we had 11 audits that didn't have written policies on internal control procedures over federal compliance. When the uniform guidance was first new, they actually made this a requirement that you had to have written policies. You were supposed to have policies all along, and most places probably had had policies. They were just verbal or unwritten, but the uniform guidance required you to have those in writing. So when that first came into effect, we saw a lot of audits that didn't have these written policies, almost like the GASB 54. I don't think this is very common any longer. We're seeing everybody has pretty much corrected this and everything is fixed. Procurement, suspension, and debarment. Only had 4 audits where we had problems with this, and like there are other comments, these federal comments are very common with our other types of entities, basically relating to when you're contracting with various companies. There's a website to go out and check and make sure that they haven't been suspended or debarred before you procure items from them. If they've been federally suspended or debarred, you're not allowed to contract with them. We had 3 audits that had some reporting issues, some of the reporting requirements. Sometimes you have to submit various reports, maybe monthly, quarterly, annually, whatever, with your federal agency. That sometimes some of those reports were filed late. We also had a couple instances with the information that you filed with the federal entities didn't match up with the accounting system or your actual financial record. So you need to make sure what you're reporting is also in your system, reported properly. Period of availability, cash management, allowable cost. I only came across these once on different audits, so it doesn't happen a whole lot. Period of availability is just making sure you've encumbered the money or spent the money by various deadlines. Some of the COVID-19 is going to have some of these requirements, so that's going to be very important that you're following the COVID-19 period of availability and spending the money properly, the cash management, that you're drawing down money and spending the money timely. You're not holding on to a lot of cash, that you're complying with those. The allowable cost, that it's allowable for the particular program or what you spent the money for. And then we just had a couple entities with matching and earmarking where you have to make some local matching monies, that there was some little issues with this. But again, overall, I think everything was very, very good with the federal. We'll go to the next slide. We'll go over a few of our less common items. Negative fund balances. We had 6 entities had negative fund balances. This sometimes happens with grant funds. If you know your grant fund may be going negative or you're not receiving the monies, you need to try to make advances whenever possible to keep those funds positive, or make sure you're requesting drawdowns, requesting money timely so that your fund balances aren't going negative. Some of the budgetary information not agreeing to the accounting system. Again, this is common with a lot of other entities. We had, I think, 5 of the boards. We had issues where you make amendments to your budgetary information, but it doesn't get entered into your accounting system timely. So your governing boards are reviewing a lot of those reports from your accounting system. They need to make sure that information is accurate and proper as they're reviewing and making decisions. We have five times that your year-end financial statements were filed late in our Hinkle system. Some of those, the initial filing was timely, but there were errors or mistakes, and you had to go back and fix and correct them, and the refiling was filed late. So we take it that the last filing may have been late. And again, the Hinkle system filing was new a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So hopefully that's not as big of a problem recently as what it's been before. Some of these other issues really only came up like once or twice. Illegal transfers, revised code 5705.14.15.16 talks about transfers between funds, what you need to do to comply if you're moving monies between funds, certifying expenditures and doing purchase orders and super blanket purchase orders. We had a minor issue with that. Salaries not approved in minutes. Make sure that your minutes are documenting anything that's important. That's really telling everybody what's happened with your entity. So if there's salaries or other things are being approved, that all needs to be in the minutes. We had one time that there wasn't a SOC 1 report. A SOC is for service organizations, and a lot of people don't use service organizations, but if you have an outside service organization that handles some of your financial aspects, they have to have what's called a SOC 1 report, which is a control report, or have auditors go in and test the controls to make sure that you can rely that there's controls at that service organization that you're depending on, that they have internal controls in place. Next slide, please. All these items, again, only happen like once or twice. A fraud reporting system that's in our compliance supplement, that you have to make people aware of the fraud reporting system of new hires and existing employees, checking finding for recovery database as you're contracting with people and individuals. There's a place to check the database that nobody has a finding for recovery named after them, almost like the federal suspension and debarment. You can't contract with somebody that owes our office a finding for recovery. Another somewhat payroll thing with the minutes, a retroactive pay increase not approved in minutes. The credit cards and public records that I talked about at the very beginning. Again, because it was new, I think I've only found one place that had a credit card recommendation and a public records recommendation, but those are two areas that going forward, know that the auditor is going to be looking at a little bit closer, that you need to be a little bit more aware of. Executive sessions, that's part of the public records and the sunshine laws. Make sure if you go into an executive session that you're documenting why, and that it's a proper purpose to go into an executive session. And now that everything is computerized, should have a good written disaster recovery plan for your computer. If something happens, how are you going to recover any of the computer information, and that you're backing the stuff up, and that you're backing it up and storing it offsite. And we had one place that didn't have those. Next slide. Wrap it up with a few helpful suggestions. Again, continue to seek additional training. There's always changes. There's always something going on. We're required as auditors to have so much continuing education every year. You can never learn enough, and we're all learning new stuff every day. So keep getting training whenever you can. Look for stuff that's out on our website. If you can't get the training, there may be useful information on our website that you can find. Make sure that you understand audit comments that you've had in the past. I've had just audits in general. Sometimes we have repeat comments over and over and over again, and then you find out, well, the client really didn't understand the comment or what it meant or how they needed to address it. And sometimes if it's a compliant issue or the way some of these things are written, they may get very confusing. So make sure before your auditors leave, when you have a post-audit meeting or exit conference, or even if you waive that meeting, make sure you talk with your auditors. You understand what the comments mean, what you're supposed to do to address it and fix it and correct it so you can fix them. If you have legal questions, and probably most of the questions that come to our office are more legal than accounting-wise. We're accountants, we're not attorneys, but if you have questions that are more legal, seek legal advice from your internal legal counsel. Go to your county prosecutor. If you have other legal counsel, talk to them first. Although we have a legal division with our office, they're very restricted with how much advice that they can give to clients, or mainly for legal advice for our people. They're always going to say, talk to your legal counsel first. So go to the county prosecutor, get a written legal opinion. You can always submit it to our office afterwards if you want us to review it to make sure that we agree with it. But again, try to seek legal advice from your internal auditors. And lastly, as I said, call your friendly auditors with questions. Be it if it's Auditor of State, if it's IPAs, email them, call them, call the regional offices if you're not sure who your specific auditor is or that you've had in the past. and try to get any questions you can answered beforehand. And with that, we can go on to the next slide. And I think I'm done with what I wanted to go over with, and questions that I wasn't able to address or take care of. Rhonda and I can try to address them now with what time we have left.
Well, Fonda, are you going to go over the questions for us, or would you like for us to pull up the chat?
Whatever is easier. I can, hopefully I had everybody put them in the chat so you guys had like a preview of them. So let me go over to the
I just say we can see the chat, so we weren't sure how it would look for us, but I think we can just run through them.
That would be perfect.
Sure, we'd be glad to. Rich and I'll cover those as best we can. I anticipate there's a couple that we probably can't, and if we can't, we're happy to get a response as quickly as we can. All right, so the first one talks about how do we know which will be tested by CFDA number. Unfortunately, until you prepare that federal schedule and we come in and do that risk assessment, you can look at those in the auditor requirements in the UG as far as what we would use to determine those by CFDA number. And then at that point in time, our auditors touch base with our single audit coordinator, who's Courtney Schlosky in our office. And if you see on the last page of the slides, you'll notice that there is an inbox email address, and she monitors that email address. And so the auditors contact her to say, this is the programs that we need to audit. And there's not a testing form, a FACR form for those. And if it's a major program, either the person in the field, the auditor will write that testing program, or our federal group that Courtney oversees will write that FACR for them. Unfortunately, right now, it's difficult for us to determine what actually will be major programs for our 630 audits, because it depends on how far back they go to reimburse expenditures, how much they reimburse in that March to June timeframe. For 1231, we do anticipate many of the programs being a major program. CARES Act for many will be for your particular group. It depends on how much funding comes through. And I know a lot of that funding, the dollar amounts of what you've expended won't really be known until for those 1231s until the end of the year. So if we have one available, great, but they are built from the compliance supplement. So if you go look, like Rich said, out to that compliance supplement, look for that CFDA number in the COVID addendum. If it's an existing program, you would want to probably refer to both, because they'll have the original program, and you'll know what those requirements are in addition to what your subgrant with OMB says. And so that's where we pull in those pass-through requirements. So the next person asked, will the AOS be creating a FACR for the SOAR grant? Again, at this point in time, we don't know if there is a significant amount of funding to drive that to a type A. And so all COVID funding is not necessarily high risk, but it's a higher risk because it is new and it's not been audited before. So if it hits a major program threshold, which is typically the 750,000 if it's a type A, then we would probably need to test that, and a FACR would be developed. If it is several people needing that FACR, we'll develop it internally in the center and then post that to our website. All right, the next question says, are you saying that SOAR 2.0 should be listed on the SEPA as a COVID program? So that is correct. It is part of your existing program. So SOAR will be listed as a program, and then under that, what is COVID specific would need to be a separate line, kind of what was in that example. And so you would have your regular program, and then you would have under that a COVID identifier in front, but it would all still be part of that SOAR program. The next question says, can I repeat the differences between a subrecipient and a contractor? Yeah, in the UG, that's in section 200.330, and that actually provides a lot of detail. If you go look at that, it provides a lot of detail on what the differences are. And so if you have a contractor that's providing a goods or a service that is not subject to that compliance requirement. They're not making program decisions. You're not just handing them money saying, okay, take care of this program, or I want you to do this piece or part of a program. You're just paying for a good or service. That's really a contractor. But it details like 5 different things for a subrecipient: determine who is eligible, you know, who has to make the programmatic decisions, who's responsible for the federal compliance requirements. And so I would, we have a checklist that we run through as auditors that's quite extensive. And so, you know, it's something that you want to take a look at every piece and part of what you're doing. But if you're handing it over to your community partner saying, I need you to take care of this program, or this compliance requirement of this program that we have, then you've created probably a sub-grant relationship. If it's just a goods or service, or you're just reimbursing someone for something that they've purchased, you know, that wouldn't necessarily meet that criteria of a subrecipient. Right, so the next one, questions for the, it says, shall each board create its own table B that lists all federal awards received by the board? Amounts, CFDA description, dates, provider names, and so forth. For audit purposes, for internal purposes, that might be very useful. For audit purposes, we need the federal schedule more so than a table B. I mean, that would help us know if you've accounted for all your programs on your CFA, but the table B itself would be a useful tool, but it's not a requirement for your audit. Second, it says, on the federal assistance schedule, shall the boards report a federal grantor, pass-through grantor, the last entity that sent us the funds? So your pass-through would be the last person that sent your funds. So OMOS sends it on your block grant. They're sending your SOAR grant. That would be your pass-through agency. And that's who you would list as the pass-through on that CFA. Now, if you received money from one of the 5 counties and or the city that received funding directly, then you would have them as your pass-through. Because you would have those requirements that you have to adhere to. It could be that you even received CARES Act dollars from a House Bill 481 or 614 that were passed to counties that weren't one of those direct recipients, townships and municipalities. And if so, then that's another layer of pass-through. So you have to know where your money's coming from, and that, unless you're receiving it directly, you will always have a pass-through, and that's the person that you receive the monies from. All right, so the example, see here, says if we are part of a regional project and OMOS sends the funds to the regional board, then the regional board sends the funds to us. Okay, so that's when you've got different layers involved, and that is when it's difficult to know who's responsible for what compliance requirements. And if you are administering the program for that regional board, then yes, you would list them as the pass-through agency. But the agreement you have with them should explicitly state if it's a subaward. That is a requirement in the uniform guidance. All right, so shall the boards have a separate account for each different CFDA number or federal program? And so separate account, I'm assuming meaning a separate fund. Okay, so the federal government requires separate accountability. And so you have to be able to, each pot of money has to be able to be identified separately within your documentation. So you can make sure that you've spent it for the right purposes, that you can do your reporting, and that when they come in, if they should come in and look at the program, that you have everything for that program in one area. And this can be done in several ways. And so if your system, if you have like the SOAR 2.0 as part of your SOAR program, it wouldn't necessarily be a separate fund, but you might, if you have a cost center ability within your system, then you can put it in a separate cost center. And so everything identified for that program would be in that cost center. We have some that maintain spreadsheets that say, okay, this is how much we got, this is how much we spent for it. It's that separate accountability. What drives a different fund is the GASB requirements. And so GASB, and sometimes Ohio law does that. And so you have to know what, under the GASB requirements that I listed in that slide presentation, if that would drive you to have a separate fund But all CARES Act money is CARES Act. And so you would be, each pot of money be accounted for separately, but maybe within the same fund. It does get a little confusing. So I would focus on where you're supposed to report it in accordance with the law and with the GASB requirements. And once you've identified if you need a special revenue fund or not, then even within that, or if it's to be accounted for in your general fund, you would make sure you had some type of tracking to make sure you got that separate accountability. All right, so the question is, can you explain the difference between a fiscal audit and a fiscal review? A financial audit is done by the Auditor of State's office or a CPA firm that contracts to do the work. A fiscal review, I'm assuming, would probably be done by OMS. And I'm not familiar with what their process is, but your financial audit, you are required to have an audit annually if you are a single audit. So if you're currently not, and we've identified some are back and forth and one that's not, if you do find as a result of the COVID funding or other funding that you've received that you are a single audit, you need to notify your regional office for the Auditor of State's office and make sure you're on their book of business, because you are required to have that on it. It's based on a fiscal year if you've expended more than $750,000 or more. Okay, so what is the best approach by the boards if we are being sent funds from OMS prior to knowing the CFDA number on these particular funds? And that's I mean, all of these are very good questions, but this is very difficult because you don't know quite what to do with it. We've even had some entities that just shows up in their bank account. So I would just recommend that you track that separately until you know exactly what that is. To reach out to OMS and try to get that identified. So Fonda, I think that we're probably at our max time. If you want to wrap us up, we'll be glad. If Fonda's going to capture these and then she's going to make them available to us, and we'll make sure that we get a response back to you within probably the next 7 to 10 days. I will assure you that our office is using the maximum flexibility. That is the goal, the maximum flexibility in the auditing these requirements and these programs. And so, but we are still bound by the rules that are set out by the federal government. So, but we will at all costs, and of course, any well-reasoned legal response we will definitely take into consideration. So if ever in doubt, we can't stress enough, talk to your legal counsel. So thank you so much for having us today.
Well, I just want to thank Rhonda and Richard. This was an excellent presentation. I know there's a number of questions still in the chat box. That's why we asked you guys to put them in there, because we had a feeling that we were going to run out of time. But thankfully, Rhonda and Richard have committed to answering these questions. As soon as I get a response back from them, I will send them out to all participants. As well as I mentioned earlier, we have recorded the training, because I know some of them, you guys have sent me private messages indicating how well the training was, and hopefully that we recorded. So yes, we have recorded. But like I said, once again, I just want to thank Rhonda and Richard. This was extremely helpful. And for the rest of the attendees, stay tuned. You'll be getting information from me regarding a link to the recording, as well as when I get responses back, I'll get them out to everybody. But thank you guys.